August 15, 1945. Dawn breaks over the Mojave Desert. The air is still cool, but in 2 hours it will be unbearable. A young lieutenant stands at the edge of what looks like an ocean of steel. Sherman tanks, thousands of them, row after row stretching toward the horizon until they blur into heat, shimmer and distance. He has a clipboard in his hand and a question from the War Department that no victor in history has ever had to answer. What do we do with them? He lights a cigarette with shaking hands. Not from fear, from the weight of realization. He drove one of these machines across France. He lost friends inside their burning hulls. He watched these steel beasts crush the Third Reich beneath their treads. And now, barely a week after the surrender, his nation is asking the most dangerous question an empire can ask. Not how to use victory, but what to do with it. 3,000 miles east, in a cramped office in Moscow, a Soviet intelligence officer reads a report and goes pale. The numbers cannot be real. 90,000 American tanks produced in 4 years. His hands tremble as he recalculates. The entire Soviet Union, with its total war economy and 20 million dead, produced 65,000. Germany, with its legendary industrial power, barely managed 50,000. And America did this while also building the world's largest navy, the world's largest air force, and feeding half of Europe. He writes a note in the margin of the report, underlining it 3 times. We did not defeat Germany. We defeated one part of the factory. The Americans are the factory. But what terrifies him more is the second part of the report. The part his superiors will not believe. The Americans are throwing them away, selling them, scrapping them, abandoning them in fields and jungles and pushing them into the ocean. A nation does not destroy its own army 1 week after the greatest military victory in human history. Not while Soviet tanks occupy half of Europe. Not while Stalin plans the next phase of expansion. It must be disinformation. A trick. But it is not a trick. It is something far more powerful than tanks. It is American confidence. The kind that comes from knowing you can build 90,000 tanks in 4 years, so you do not need to keep them. The kind that rewrites the rules of power and makes dictators lose sleep. In a prisoner of war camp in Kansas, a German panzer commander watches American tanks being loaded onto flatbed trains bound for scrap yards. He turns to a fellow officer, a veteran of Kursk and Normandy, and says something that neither of them will ever forget. Now I understand why we lost. We fought a nation that can afford to throw away what we would have died to possess. His name was Robert Heinrich. Before the war, he taught mathematics at a gymnasium in Munich. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1939 and commanded a Panther tank by 1944. He was a good officer, smart, careful with his men's lives. He survived the Eastern Front and the Western Front and the final collapse. He spent 2 years in American captivity and returned to Germany in 1947 to find his city in ruins and his profession gone. He never taught mathematics again. He became an accountant. A good one. He married, had 3 children, rebuilt his life in the new Federal Republic. But, until he died in 1982, he kept a notebook from his time as a prisoner in Kansas. In it, he had written observations about American military power, about the vast fields of equipment, about the casual waste, about the sheer abundance that characterized everything the Americans did. On the last page, in careful handwriting, he had written a conclusion. The Americans did not win the war with better tanks or better tactics or better soldiers. They won it with more of everything, more production, more logistics, more food, more fuel, more confidence. They did not fight to survive. They fought from abundance. And abundance, deployed without restraint, is the most terrifying weapon in history. He was right. But even he did not understand the full implications of what he had witnessed. Because what happened to America's tank fleet after World War II was not waste. It was strategy. And it would shape the next 70 years of human history. September 1945. The Philippines. Staff Sergeant James Kowalski stands on a beach on Luzon and watches something that makes him physically sick. Engineers are driving Sherman tanks into the ocean. Not damaged tanks. Not broken down hulls. Fully functional machines, fresh from the motor pool, their engines running, their guns loaded. One by one, they roll down the beach, into the surf, and disappear beneath the waves. His tank, the one he named Detroit Steel, the one that carried him through 3 amphibious assaults, the one he painted his daughter's name on, gone, sunk in 20 feet of water. An officer sees his face and walks over. I know how you feel, Sergeant. Orders are orders. Shipping them home costs more than building new ones. Kowalski does not respond, cannot respond. He watches another Sherman roll into the water, watches the waves close over the turret, watches the Bubbles rise and then stop. He thinks about the factory workers in Detroit who built that tank. The riveters and welders and assembly line workers who put in 60-hour weeks to produce the arsenal of democracy. He wonders if they know, if they understand that their work, their sacrifice, is being dumped into the Pacific like garbage. What he does not know, what none of the soldiers on that beach know, is that this is not carelessness. This is calculation. Cold, ruthless, economically rational calculation. The United States has produced so many tanks that they have become disposable. The cost of a Liberty ship voyage across the Pacific exceeds the depreciated value of a used Sherman. The ships are needed to bring soldiers home. Priorities have shifted. The tanks have done their job. In Washington, military planners are making decisions that will define the post-war world. Keep a small armored force in Europe as part of the occupation. Transfer thousands of tanks to allies under the new policy of containment. Sell surplus equipment to anyone willing to pay. And abandon the rest. Leave them where they sit. In jungles. In deserts. On islands whose names appear on no civilian maps. The logistics of victory are over. The logistics of peace have begun. October 1945. A depot outside Frankfurt, Germany. Private First Class Robert Mitchell wakes up inside his tank for the last time. He has spent the night curled up in the driver's seat of Iowa Pride, the Sherman that carried him from Normandy to the Elbe. The metal is cold. The air smells of oil and old sweat and memories. Outside, dawn is breaking over a field of abandoned tanks. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all waiting for crews that will never return. He climbs out slowly, his joints stiff from sleeping in the cramped compartment. His orders are clear. Strip anything valuable. Radios, machine, guns, optics, ammunition. Then disable the engine and walk away. He and his crew spend the morning pulling equipment, their movements mechanical, their faces blank. They do not talk. There is nothing to say. By noon, Iowa Pride is gutted. Her machine guns are gone. Her radio is gone. Her periscopes are crated for shipment. Mitchell takes a hammer and smashes the distributor cap so the engine can never start again. It feels like murder, like killing something that trusted him. He places his hand on the hull one last time, feeling the scars from bullets and shrapnel, and then he walks away. Does not look back, cannot look back. He will return to Iowa, marry his high school sweetheart, raise 4 children, run a hardware store, and live a long and prosperous life. But he will never talk about the war, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. And when he dies in 1989, his family will find a single photograph in his wallet. A young man in a tanker's uniform, grinning at the camera, standing in front of a Sherman with Iowa Pride painted on the turret. On the back, in faded pencil, they built her in Detroit. I drove her to Berlin. They left her to die in Germany. I never understood why. This is why. And it is more shocking than any of them imagined. By the end of 1945, the United States had 90,000 tanks scattered across every continent except Antarctica. Bringing them all home would require a maritime operation nearly as large as the invasion of Europe. It would cost billions of dollars. It would take years. And for what? To store them in depots across the American Southwest. To maintain them. To keep them ready for a war that everyone prayed would never come. The American public was exhausted. The soldiers wanted to come home. The factories that had produced tanks were already retooling for peacetime. Refrigerators, automobiles, washing machines. The great engine of American industry that had built the arsenal of democracy was pivoting toward the arsenal of prosperity. There was no political will to maintain a massive armored force. No economic logic. No strategic reason. But there was another calculation. A darker one. Even as the surrender documents were signed in Tokyo Bay, American planners were looking east. Toward Moscow. Toward the vast Red Empire whose armies now occupied Eastern Europe. The wartime alliance was already fracturing. The Cold War had not been named yet, but it was taking shape in the minds of generals and diplomats. And in that new conflict, the question was not whether America needed tanks. It was what kind, how many, and where. The answer came in stages, and it shocked everyone. Stage 1 was abandonment. Pure, calculated abandonment. In the Pacific Theater, on Okinawa and Luzon and dozens of smaller islands, American crews received orders that seemed insane. Do not bring the tanks home. Strip them of valuable components and leave the hulls. In some cases, bulldozers pushed Shermans into the ocean. In others, they were driven into jungles and left to vines and rust in time. A naval officer later recalled supervising the ocean dumping operation and feeling like he was conducting a mass funeral. Except the bodies were still alive, still functional, still capable of war. They were being drowned for purely economic reasons. The cost of shipping a 30-ton tank across the Pacific exceeded the cost of building a replacement. Ships were needed for soldiers, not steel. The arithmetic was brutal but undeniable. Stage 2 was redistribution. Thousands of Shermans were transferred to Allied nations under the new framework of American foreign policy. Britain received tanks. France received tanks. Italy, Greece, Turkey, all the nations that would form the southern flank of NATO, received tanks. The Sherman that had liberated Europe was now being repurposed to defend it, to create a wall of steel between Western democracy and Soviet communism. Some nations were surprised by American generosity. Others were suspicious. Was this genuine aid or a way to bind them to American interests? The answer was both. The tanks came with strings, training programs, spare parts contracts, maintenance agreements, ammunition supplies. Each Sherman transferred was a link in a chain that tied Europe to American power. Stage 3 was commercialization. The United States government began selling surplus tanks to anyone willing to pay. Israel bought Shermans and used them to win the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Egypt bought Shermans and used them to defend against Israel. Pakistan bought them. India bought them. The Sherman became the most widely distributed tank in history, serving in armies on 6 continents, fighting in conflicts from the deserts of Sinai to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Some of these sales were strategic, some were purely commercial. The United States did not particularly care whether the buyer was a democracy or a dictatorship, an ally or a neutral. The goal was to empty the depots and recover some fraction of the enormous investment. Tanks that had cost $50,000 to build in 1943 were sold for $5,000 in 1947. It was the greatest military surplus sale in history. And Stage 4 was the most shocking of all. The tanks that made it home. By 1946, nearly 20,000 Shermans had been shipped back to the United States. They arrived in convoys, stacked on trains, delivered to massive depots in California, Arizona, Texas. These were not museums. They were graveyards. Fields of steel extending beyond sight. Rows so long you could walk for an hour and never reach the end. The official designation was Strategic Reserve. The idea was that in the event of another war, these tanks could be refurbished and deployed. But Strategic Reserve requires maintenance, greasing treads, draining fluids, protecting engines from corrosion. It requires money and manpower. And in the post-war budget cuts, there was neither. By 1950, when war broke out in Korea, the Army discovered the cost of neglect. Thousands of stored Shermans were inoperable. Engines seized. Transmissions rusted. Electrical systems destroyed by weather and rodents. The Strategic Reserve was a strategic disaster. Engineers were sent to the depots with cutting torches and salvage orders. Engines were pulled and sent to Korea. Turrets were removed for use as fixed fortifications. The rest was sold as scrap. It was the final humiliation. Tanks that had stormed the beaches of Normandy were melted down and turned into rebar. Some of that steel went into highway construction. Some went into suburban homes. The interstate highway system, the great infrastructure project that would define post-war America, was built partly from the melted remains of the machines that had saved the nation. There is a strange poetry in that. Swords beaten into plowshares, except the plowshares were highways and shopping malls and the steel bones of a new world. The tools of war repurposed into the infrastructure of peace. The Sherman did not disappear. It transformed. It became the roads Americans drove on, the buildings they worked in, the bridges they crossed on their way to prosperous futures. But not every tank was melted down. Not every Sherman was forgotten. In small towns across America, tanks appeared on pedestals in courthouse squares. Veterans gathered around them on Memorial Day, touching the cold metal, remembering friends who did not come home, remembering the sound of the engine, the smell of cordite, the terror and exhilaration of combat. In foreign nations, Shermans continued to serve. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Israeli Shermans faced Egyptian Shermans, both supplied by the United States. In 1965, during the Indo-Pakistani War, Shermans fought in the deserts of the Rann of Kutch. The tank declared obsolete in 1945 was still killing in 1965, still serving, still relevant. And in museums, in private collections, in the hands of historians and military enthusiasts, a few hundred Shermans survived intact. They were restored, maintained, kept in running condition. Today you can see them at military shows and reenactments, their engines roaring, their treads clanking. They are ghosts. Mechanical memories of a war that shaped everything that came after. What shocked the world was not that America built 90,000 tanks. The world had watched that happen. What shocked the world was what America did afterward. Other empires hoarded their weapons. Other victors maintained vast armies, kept their fleets ready, their arsenals full. Rome did it. Britain did it. Every empire in history did it because empires understood that power must be displayed, maintained, protected. America did the opposite. America dismantled the greatest armored force in history and went home. Sold the tanks, scrapped them, abandoned them, turned the factories back to making consumer goods. It was an act of strategic confidence so profound it bordered on arrogance. It was a declaration that America did not need a massive standing army to remain secure. That oceans and allies and nuclear weapons and industrial capacity would be enough. That the citizen soldiers who won the war could return to civilian life, and the machines they fought in could rust in peace. It was also a statement about the nature of American power. The power was not in the tanks. It was in the ability to build them. The factories could be retooled. The workers could be recalled. The assembly lines could roar back to life if needed. The tanks were temporary. The capacity was permanent. And capacity, industrial and economic and ideological, was the real weapon. The Sherman was just steel. America was the forge. There is a photograph from the early 1950s that captures this moment perfectly. It was published in Life magazine. It shows a depot in California, a field of Sherman tanks stretching toward distant mountains. The sun is setting, and long shadows stretch across the desert floor. In the foreground, a single tank sits apart from the others. Its hatch is open. A bird, a hawk or a raven, perches on the gun barrel, looking west toward the mountains. You cannot help but feel that the bird understands something the tanks cannot. That the war is over. That the world has moved on. That these machines, once the most fearsome weapons on earth, are now monuments to a moment that will never return. The German tankers who faced Shermans in Normandy would have understood the irony. They believed in the superiority of their Panthers and Tigers. They believed in German engineering. They learned too late that wars are not won by the best tank. They are won by the most tanks. By the nation that can afford to build them, ship them, lose them, and build more. The Japanese soldiers who watched Shermans crawl up the beaches of Iwo Jima believed in the spirit of Bushido. In willpower over material. They learned too late that spirit cannot stop steel. That the American way of war, lavish and mechanized and overwhelmingly material, was not weakness. It was strength beyond measure. And now, in the silence of desert depots and jungle ruins and ocean floors, the Shermans taught one final lesson. That even the mightiest weapons are temporary. That even the greatest victories fade. That the tools of war must eventually give way to the works of peace. By the end of the 1950s, the great tank depots were empty. The Shermans were gone. The U.S. Army had moved on to new machines. The M48 Patton. The M60. Eventually the M1 Abrams. The Cold War demanded new weapons for new conflicts. The Sherman belonged to a different era. An era of moral clarity, when enemies wore uniforms and battles had defined front lines. But the legacy endured. It endured in the defense treaties that bound free nations together. In the military alliances that defined the post-war order. In the industrial base that pivoted from tanks to cars to computers to spacecraft. In the memory of men who crewed them, who carried the war inside them for the rest of their lives. And it endured in an idea, radical in 1945 and still radical now, that a democracy can mobilize for total war, win that war, and then dismantle the machinery of victory without losing security or soul. That the strength of a free nation lies not in its weapons but in the people and principles that produce them. That abundance, not scarcity, is the foundation of power. That freedom, not force, is the ultimate guarantee of peace. Staff Sergeant James Kowalski, who watched his tank roll into the Pacific in 1945, lived to be 93. He never spoke about the war, never joined the VFW, never attended reunions. But in 2009, divers discovered a Sherman in 20 feet of water off the coast of Luzon. It was covered in coral, inhabited by fish, slowly dissolving into the ocean. The turret was still intact, the gun still pointed toward shore. And on the hull, barely visible beneath decades of marine growth, was a name painted in fading white letters. Detroit Steel. Someone sent Kowalski a photograph. He looked at it for a long time, his hands shaking, his eyes wet. Then he put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. When he died 3 years later, his daughter found the photograph and dozens of others he had never shown anyone. Pictures of his crew. Pictures of the tank. Pictures of battles and beaches and moments frozen in time. On the back of the photo showing Detroit Steel in the ocean, he had written a single sentence in the cramped handwriting of very old age. She carried me through hell and I abandoned her. I am sorry. But he had nothing to be sorry for. He did not abandon her. History did. Progress did. Peace did. The tank was a tool, and when the job was done, the tool was set aside. That is not betrayal. That is wisdom. This is what really happened to America's tank fleet after World War II. It was scattered and sold and scrapped and forgotten. Not from carelessness but from confidence. Not from weakness but from strength. The confidence that if the tanks were needed again, America could build them. The strength to let them go when they were not. Other nations kept their swords sharp. America turned its swords into highways. Other empires clung to symbols of power. America trusted that power lay elsewhere. In its people. In its principles. In the capacity to build again if needed, but the wisdom to live in peace if possible. The Sherman tanks are gone now. Most of them. But the lesson remains. That the true measure of strength is not what you hold but what you can afford to let go. That the greatest victories are won not on battlefields but in the choices made when battle is over. That abundance, wielded wisely, is the ultimate weapon. And that freedom, defended fiercely and released gracefully, is the only cause worth fighting for. In the end, the tanks were just steel, temporary, mortal. But the nation that built them, the idea that nation represented, proved to be something else entirely. Something enduring. Something that survived the rusting of armor and fading of paint and the long slow passage of years. Something that, even now, stands watch over the world, not with turrets and guns, but with the quiet confidence of a people who know they can build anything they need, and who have learned, at great cost and with great wisdom, when to build and when to let go.